Hi everybody. I hope you had a good Christmas if you celebrate it. I know it hasn't been the Christmas many of us had hoped for. I'm afraid the channel's been a bit low on my priority list as of late. I apologise for that. No whimsical Christmas poem this year. In fact, I wasn't planning on making any video at all, but I had a little time today and I thought I've got to make one more in 2021. And so this is a bit of an unplanned video, but it's designed for people feeling slightly alienated by the polarised discussion around COVID. Actually, I'm thinking of calling the video Why I Don't Make COVID Videos Anymore. And I think there are two main reasons, the first of which you've probably heard before, but I think the second perhaps we need to hear a bit more often. I scrolled through my channel in 2021. I've actually only made 3 videos related to COVID, the last of which wasn't even about COVID, it was about Jimmy Kimmel, and a subject that I care much more about than COVID, which is comedy, and that was something like 6 months ago. And let's be honest, my channel was a lot smaller pre-pandemic. It grew quite a bit last year. Bad news for the world was good news for medical YouTubers. But I haven't followed that growth strategy very well this year. Other medical YouTubers or tweeters or Instagrammers or whatever have seen their audiences continue to swell. Generating COVID content has been a shot in the arm for views. Now, please note, I'm not suggesting that other channels have done that cynically, nor that views has been their motivation. In fact, I tip my hat to many of them for their ongoing dedication, researching, writing, shooting. I just couldn't do it, not only due to family or clinical commitments and so on, but just a lack of ability to muster the energy to go through everything for a video. Having said that, some of those channels definitely have done it as the worst form of grifting, especially those encouraging people to drift towards the fringes of beliefs, like espousing a cult-like devotion to unproven therapies, or feeding conspiratorial rumours, repeatedly inferring causality from correlation, and promoting their daft pet theories. Or those using fear as their currency, desperately attempting to make each new development sound as scary as possible and frame themselves as a COVID expert you need to keep coming back to. And that's the first reason that's put me off talking about COVID publicly. I guess to continue the comedy analogy, Dave Chappelle talks about leaving money on the table, and when I spend ages on a labour of love video that I really want to make, like my Silly Vitamins one, and it gets way fewer views than me just doing a piece to camera like this, but talking about COVID, it's disappointing. But to be clear, I'm absolutely fine with that. I don't want to make it sound like I'm some virtuous saint here. I'm making the videos I want to make. Geez, in the opening paragraph I've managed to make myself sound really noble and compared myself to notably uncontroversial character Dave Chappelle. I really should have just stuck to the notes I'd made beforehand. Mental note, don't ad lib. I think I've had too many brandy-filled mince pies. An easy answer as to why I've canned the COVID content is that I find other topics more interesting. And I do. But it's more than just that. Of course, I am interested in COVID. I see it every day. And I do want to use this channel to try to explain things to all of you. And I've had a lot of thoughts regarding the pandemic rattling around in my head for a while. So even though I've written this in one go just now, it's been kind of cooking for a little while, and several things have prompted me to make it, in spite of all the tribalism that I find so off-putting. First off are conversations I have had with friends, both non-medical and medical, and of course with patients. Normal people. Just like most people in the world, they don't live their lives on Twitter or YouTube that much. The online discussion is dominated by those with the strongest opinions and the loudest voices, and some of the channels and accounts that have grown the most are those who encourage that vociferous polarization. For whatever reason, well, quite predictable ones to be honest, the pandemic has become a proxy for the culture wars. And I think a lot of people find themselves a bit lost in the middle, and maybe that's you. On one side, you've got the anti-mask, anti-lockdown, anti-science brigade that I think we're all familiar with. But on the other side, there is a highly zealous group who are unwilling to accept almost any level of risk and are pro-school closure, pro-vaccine mandate, pro-masking toddlers, vaccines for kids, and so on. And they're just as guilty of cherry-picking evidence as the first group, but when they make their long Twitter threads, they're given, I guess, more of a free pass because their motivation is ostensibly purer. And both sides are guilty of mischaracterizing the other. Now, some people are clearly ideologically guided and make absolutely no attempt to understand the topic, and they will believe whatever their tribe deems to be the truth. Let's just ignore them for now. But a lot of people claim to be guided by science or evidence, yet they come to completely opposing conclusions. The confirmation bias is so strong that their very understanding of science is skewed. They tear a paper to pieces that disagrees with their stance, but then excitedly promote one that agrees with them, irrespective of the quality of either. Or perhaps to be more charitable, they fail to recognise the limitations of what the science is suggesting. And just so we're clear, we all have biases. I absolutely have biases. I try to recognise them, but I'm no better than anybody else. Different countries all claim to be following science, but they end up doing things quite differently. Designing policy involves many considerations alongside science, which is fine, that's how the world works, but again, it is clear that there are discrepancies between countries. Now, I don't follow the US as closely as the UK, but for example, in the US, it seems to be doing things quite differently to the WHO guidance and the way we're doing things in European countries. Medical professionals probably have a different take to the general public on the pandemic. This is just my personal opinion. I'm not speaking for every healthcare professional, obviously, but I think our overwhelming feeling is one of fatigue and exhaustion. We're frustrated. We've been 100% behind attempts to control spread and reduce hospitalization for obvious reasons. But almost 2 years in, we're just flabbergasted that for all the slogans of follow the science, we're not always following the science. That's when there even is science. At this point in the pandemic, why are we still operating as though it's March 2020? Why don't we have better evidence for what we're doing? Back then, I was completely in favour of erring on the side of caution with no data to guide us, but now we shouldn't still be waiting for proof. For years now, I've been highlighting things we do in medicine on this channel, on Twitter, that don't have clear evidence, and this is really not any different. There's no excuse. Many healthcare professionals have actually retired or left after what's been a hellish almost 2 years. We've still got restrictions on things like face-to-face consultations with patients. Family members are unable to visit hospitalised patients. All of us have got stories about patients that died alone, which will stay with us for the rest of our careers. People have missed loved ones' funerals. The CDC in America is currently recommending masks for over 2s. Other countries are making people wear masks outdoors. And maybe these are all the right decisions, but we shouldn't still be guessing. Let's talk about vaccines. Imagine it's 2019. None of us had heard about COVID. Happier times, huh? At that time, we'd seen 2 decades of rapidly deteriorating vaccine misinformation. Well, longer than that, but 2 decades since the infamous MMR paper that really increased things. But to be anti-vaccine at that stage was an indefensible position based on no credible evidence. It was the fringes of society, and although very vocal, small numbers. Vaccines are one of the greatest triumphs in medical history. In fact, I'd say in the entire history of the world, and have saved countless millions of lives, perhaps billions. Something that I found quite funny is last week, you know who described vaccines in almost exactly the same way? Donald J. Trump, which really confused a lot of his supporters. Every day when I arrived at medical school, I was greeted by St. George's Hospital's most famous old boy, the father of vaccination, Edward Jenner. His statue was in the atrium. And in the library, the preserved hide of Blossom the cow, whose cowpox allowed 8-year-old James Phipps to become the first recipient of a vaccine against smallpox. Informed consent was really not a thing back then. Vaccines are in my blood, metaphorically and literally. But now, people who would have shared my revulsion against vaccine misinformation in 2019 are finding themselves labelled anti-vaxxers in 2021 for not being 100% positive about COVID vaccines. Even I have been called this at least a dozen times online simply because I've attempted to understand some of the nuances. So that's weird, right? Sharing published science in reputable journals has been deemed misinformation and censored on social media. Now, to make it clear that I am not an anti-vaxxer, which is not a sentence I ever thought I'd have to say, I would advise all eligible adults to get vaccinated against COVID. But there are some additional qualifiers to that, based on good quality evidence, not some crank. Things like the choice of vaccines, the timing between doses, the age group of the recipient, the number of doses. Boosters do work, but how they should be deployed is more complicated than it was when the vaccine first came out. Unfortunately, a major drawback of the vaccines, and based on recent British and Israeli data, even more so the boosters, has been that their protection is much shorter than originally hoped. Trying to understand the way to achieve the best protection for the most people is not the same as being anti-vax, and our failure to openly discuss the complexities of this, I think, is a huge mistake. Once again, we're trying to divide real, messy medicine into neat, binary answers of either everyone gets every dose in the same way or nobody gets any doses. Now, there's only one person who can successfully dichotomize something so complex into two categories, and he's taking a well-earned break at home at the North Pole. Now, here's one of the conversations that I had that made me want to make this video. I was at dinner a little while ago with my oldest friends that I've known since I arrived in the UK. 3 of us fully vaccinated. The 4th had only had 1 dose. And I asked how come, and he said he'd heard about a danger of myocarditis, inflammation in the heart, in young men. Now, when we had this conversation, the concern was regarding 16 to 24-year-old men, so I thought it was a little touching. I said, dude, it's very sweet that you see yourself as a strapping young lad, but you're 40, you've got a pot belly, and I got the finger in exchange. This is mature scientific discourse, of course, but seriously, he's got a couple of risk factors for heart disease. He's not the fittest guy in the world. He's got a very strong family history of medical conditions. He's got a very frail parent. He will definitely benefit from the COVID vaccine. Now, this man is not anti-vax. His wife is actually a doctor, but he would now be referred to as vaccine skeptical. When I talked to him about vaccines and myocarditis and everything, he said he hadn't heard anybody publicly talk about it openly like that, and he was fed up of being criticized for his opinions. Even more clear-cut an illustration of how the pre-pandemic differentiation between anti-vax and pro-science has changed is that a fairly alarming number of healthcare professionals have not been vaccinated. I actually did a piece on BBC Radio about this because a lot of my colleagues have told me, some in confidence, some quite openly, that they've not been vaccinated. And these are nurses, physios, doctors, care workers, porters, and so on. And even with their medical experience, their knowledge that the vaccine will protect them and their vulnerable patients, a small but important number of these people have decided not to get vaccinated. Now, some estimates place unvaccination rates in the general public, in the adult population in London, at 30%. So you can no longer call this a fringe position. So we either have to say that a fifth or a quarter, if you look at the UK as a whole, of people are wacko dum-dums, or conclude that there has been a monumental failure of public health communication. A big mistake has been referring to this group as crank anti-vaxxers like you'd find pre-2019, which has alienated millions of people from believing the objective demonstrable science. And one of the few areas in the pandemic where we do have a wealth of data is vaccine efficacy. These are incredibly effective therapies. Even if you doubt information coming from the pharmaceutical companies, and Pfizer, for example, have made missteps in how they've released information, some of the best data comes from the UK intensive care network, which is completely independent. It's just a network of all the intensive care units in the UK. And that has shown that even though the unvaccinated account for a minority of the overall population, they make up the majority of COVID admissions to intensive care, i.e. the super sick are mostly unvaccinated. Moreover, they are younger than vaccinated admissions, and most have no pre-existing medical conditions, whereas the vaccinated people admitted to ITU who are very sick tend to be those with pre-existing medical problems. So vaccines are extremely good at preventing severe COVID in adults, but there are areas where the data are lacking or less clear. Obviously, as a cardiologist, I've been following all the concern about myocarditis from COVID or from the vaccines very closely. Last year I made a video explaining why the fear-mongering about millions of cases of myocarditis coming from COVID were unfounded. And this year there's been similar fear-mongering about vaccine-related myocarditis, of course from a different group. However, there are clearly cases, rare, of myocarditis caused by the vaccine. These are overwhelmingly mild and self-limiting, but they're real. So we can either bury our head in the sand, as a lot of people did for many months, and continue saying that the same vaccine advice applies to everyone, or we can try to understand that a bit better and minimize risk. A common phrase has been the risk of COVID causing myocarditis is higher than the vaccine, which undoubtedly is true for at-risk populations, particularly the elderly. But does it hold true for, say, a healthy 22-year-old man taking an mRNA vaccine? Well, thankfully that's been tested. This month we've seen more data released demonstrating that in men under the age of 40, the risk of myocarditis from the Moderna vaccine was higher than from infection, very significantly so for the second dose. We don't have data on Moderna boosters. For Pfizer doses 2 and 3, the risk of vaccine myocarditis is about the same as COVID, but of course there are many other risks from COVID alongside myocarditis. And all of these risks for that young, healthy population are low. So why is it important to recognise these details? Well, immediately we can reassure female patients that we don't see this issue for them. We can counter false claims about the rates of myocarditis. We can advise young men not to have the Moderna vaccine. We can space out doses to minimise complications and make the vaccines even safer, as we've done in the UK, for example. We can counter false claims like myocarditis being caused by inadvertent injection into the venous system. I know some YouTube channels have talked about this quite a lot. If that were the case, why does it only occur as a problem after the second dose? Why does it only occur in young males? It doesn't really make any sense. To go into boosters and the subject of childhood vaccines would make this video really, really long. But suffice to say, we're dealing with a different level of evidence here. When I consent a patient for a medical treatment, for example, it's about weighing up risks and benefits using estimations based on evidence. What's the risk of removing someone's septic appendix? Pretty low. What's the potential benefit? Huge. So that's an easy one. But what about a non-life-saving operation in a frail person? What are the risks of surgery? They may actually outweigh the benefits. Now, the benefits of vaccinating the adult population overwhelmingly outweigh the small risks. The benefits of boosters are significantly weaker overall, but they're still demonstrable. The benefits of vaccinating children are present in terms of population spread, but in terms of direct benefit, particularly to young children, that's harder to pass overall, and the risks are also unclear. I actually, just before recording this, read an article about pediatric admissions soaring with COVID. Many countries are recommending that children over the age of 5 are vaccinated, and many children will find that what they can do is restricted if they are not vaccinated. In the UK, currently only at-risk 5 to 11-year-olds are being vaccinated, i.e. ones with health conditions. And this is based on what is felt to be a clearer risk-benefit ratio. So you can ask questions as well, like if we're seeing the signal from dose number 2, should we be advocating a single-dose vaccine for healthy children? Now, I don't have the answers, and please don't interpret what I'm saying to mean that you shouldn't or should vaccinate your children. I'm just saying it's a much harder call than whether, for example, I should be vaccinated. But I don't feel that that's always apparent when you see how many doctors on Twitter are angrily criticising the chief medical officer here for refusing to roll out vaccines to all children, as if it was a very cut and dry, easy answer. What would I say to people that accuse me of just giving ammunition to people who are simply against vaccination? Well, honestly, I'm doing my utmost to present the science as it is, and I can't control if people misinterpret it in bad faith. And, some people are idiots. A fairer criticism of this video, I think, would be that the scientific community should sing from the same hymn sheet to convince as many people as possible to get vaccinated. But actually, I think acknowledging that medicine isn't perfect and actually, that actually engenders trust. And I deal with these questions every day at work. I have patients of every age, and of course, many ask about cardiac issues related to COVID and to the vaccine. And away from the screeching people on social media, funnily enough, shouting, "Believe in science" in my patients' faces, curiously doesn't seem to work, we can discuss the nuances calmly, and I think my colleagues do exactly the same thing, and we've helped people feel confident in their decisions and overcome their fears. I am concerned that the percentage of people skeptical about the efficacy or safety of vaccines is going to increase, which may have knock-on effects to childhood vaccines, flu vaccines, and trust in medical science altogether. We all know that Facebook and Twitter have destroyed the fabric of civilization, yada yada, that's all familiar territory. I'm sure you can find a video essay on this very website on the topic. But a higher proportion of people being skeptical about vaccines is not what I expected from this pandemic, and I'm honestly nervous about the future. In retrospect, I was incredibly naive last year. Early in the pandemic, I thought, this virus will put an end to anti-vaxxers once and for all, as we'll all rush out to get vaccinated when it comes out so that we can return to normal life. I was very wrong. Geez, this is way longer than I anticipated. And there's loads more I could have talked about, like school closures or further lockdowns, but those are obviously not my area of expertise, so I'd just be another dude on the internet that you really have no reason to believe. Nevertheless, the same principle of risks and benefits applies. At this stage in the pandemic, interventions need to have some evidence. Masks, the risks, for example, are essentially zero for an adult, so the level of evidence doesn't have to be so high. It would still be nice to have more than just, I think, 2 decent RCTs, Danish and Bangladeshi RCTs, but if masks hadn't become political, I think most people wouldn't have really cared. But lockdowns, or taking kids out of school, do have clear, huge negatives. They may be the right thing to do. Again, I'm not taking a side here, but we need clear evidence that their positives outweigh their negatives. I mean, I guess if you do want to draw me on one of them, for schools at present, and again, I'm admitting my bias, I've got children, but so I pay close attention to all of this. I don't think the evidence justifies any school closures at present. And based on that, we need to choose our battles. What will have the most net benefit, and what will simply further erode goodwill or trust amongst the general public, which I dare say is wearing quite thin, without a significant return on health? As I said, I don't have the answers. I do know that this pandemic will end, and life will go on, hopefully soon, and there will be far more harmful diseases and worse pandemics in our future, maybe not that far away. We should remember all of that when it comes to potentially burning up the bank account of public corporation. One day a virus will appear with a mortality rate not less than 1%, but of 5% or 10%. And that's when we'll truly need to follow science. Well, Happy New Year. I imagine I'll have just pissed off everyone with this video. In fact, I think it's probably good I made it spur of the moment, so I didn't have a chance to second guess everything and worry about what different groups would say. But if you didn't like it, please remember that what happens in 2021 stays in 2021. I think that's how it works. It's a Christmas gift from my secretary. Grapefruit flavoured IPA. It's okay. Anyway,